Now, I've been talking about the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory, but now I want to talk about a different type of theory. This is we call this working memory or parallel processing. And so, in working memory, this is analysis, right? So it's how we take information from our sensory memory and from our long-term memory and bring them together to analyze it, to break it apart, put it together, to make some other mental process so that we can then think. So if I ever ask you about somebody thinking or working or using some memory or understanding or analyzing, I'm probably talking about their working memory. And working memory theory is a little different than the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory. In the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory, we're only talking about getting information into long-term memory. So we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something. We get that into sensory memory. We focus on a specific part of it to bring it into short-term memory. And then we rehearse it to get it into long-term memory. And sometimes we can retrieve that memory to rehearse it or to use it, which we sometimes call maintenance rehearsal. Uh, Now, we could use maintenance rehearsal to just use it right now or to think about it later as well, after we retrieve it. Now, the working memory theory, or what we call parallel processing, works a little different. We still have sensory memory and we still have long-term memory, and these still work basically the same way as they work in the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory. But in parallel processing, we don't have short-term memory, or we don't think about short-term memory. It's still there, but we don't think about it in this theory. Um, we call this working memory. And the reason this is called, or sometimes called, parallel processing is because working memory happens all at once. It's not like the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory where one thing happens first, focus, and then the next thing happens, rehearsal, right? This all happens all at once. Memory comes in through sensory memory, you focus on it, and then you use all of your working memory, which includes your central executive, your visual spatial sketch patch, your episodic buffer, your phonological loop, and you might get information out of long-term memory to use it here as well. Um, and all of this happens all at once, all at the same time. It's parallel, not one thing at a time. Uh, okay. So again, where in the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory, you rehearse and then encode in long-term memory, in parallel processing, information might come from long-term memory or sensory memory, and then you analyze it in the working memory. And again, sometimes it might go from sensory to long-term and back into working memory so that it can be analyzed. And I'll talk about these sort of separately. Um, okay. Okay. So now, again, working memory has a few parts that I want to talk about. And the first one I want to talk about is your phonological loop. Now, I want you to look at the screen if you can. I'm going to be quiet for a couple of moments, and I want you to just read what it says. Okay? Now, if you knew the characters, there's a good chance that you literally heard their voices in your mind. And again, what was happening is, first of all, you read what was on the screen. That's sensory memory. And that went triggered through your episodic buffer some information in your long-term memory, the character. And so that information came through your phonological loop for you to analyze. And the analysis all happened at the same time. Um, but the analysis was basically being able to read the words in the character's voice. Again, the information came from sensory memory, pulled or triggered something in long term memory, and then using your phonological loop, you were able to hear that in your mind. Now, the visual spatial working memory is your being able to visualize things in your mind. So if I give you a math problem and you can do the math problem in your mind, right? You can see it in your mind's eye. That's your visual spatial sketch pad. If I tell you to remember your uh, Christmas tree, or I ask you what is your favorite Disney or movie scene, you could probably visualize it in your mind. And again, this is just working memory. When I ask you a question, what's your favorite movie scene? That information is coming from your sensory memory, triggering something in long-term memory. But now, using your visual spatial sketch patch to visualize that in your mind. Or if I ask you about the problem, a math problem, again, the math problem, seeing it or hearing it, that's your sensory memory. That triggers your ability to do math. And if you are visualizing the problem, you're visualizing it in your visual spatial sketch pad. Now, your episodic buffer is essentially, think about it as knowing which information to grab out of your long term memory. So when I ask you that math problem, or I tell you what's your favorite scene in a movie, or I tell you, what does Cartman sound like? Well, again, that is your episodic buffer trying to find the right piece of information to bring back into working memory for you so that then you can use it in the correct part of working memory. It just helps you to bring it out of long term memory. Oops. And then, of course, once it comes out, then it'll go into either the phonological loop or visual spatial working memory, visual spatial sketchpad for you to use. Now, the last part of working memory is your central executive. And your central executive is the part of working memory that does the work. It's doing the analysis. So if I ask you to do a problem, you got to pull out, your math problem skills out of long-term memory. You got to look at the problem on the paper. That's sensory memory. But someone has to do the work, and the work, you do it in your central executive. If I ask you, what did the red ibis, symbolize in the short story? Well, you know, reading the short story or reading a scene or reading the question, that might be sensory memory. But pulling information out, what does red symbolize? Um, what actually happened in the short story? That's probably going to come out through the episodic buffer. But then the analysis, what does red mean in this story? How can I explain that? How, uh, how does that mean this specific thing in this specific story? Could I be wrong? All of that is happening in central executive. Central executive is doing the actual work. Okay. Now, one of the things I always like to point out is that using your working memory does not mean that you have put something into long term memory. You can pull stuff out of long term memory using working memory, your episodic buffer, but you are not going to uh, put something into long-term memory forever as storage using this type of memory. How do you know that? Well, there's a good chance that you've taken a test and maybe you weren't too sure about a specific question and you thought to yourself, um, uh, I have to remember to ask somebody if they got the right question here. Um, and so you might, even though you read the question and you thought about an answer and you analyzed it and you did the work in Central Executive and you wrote an answer down, sometimes when you walk outside and you say, what was the question I wanted to ask about? You don't remember. Because even though you totally did all the working memory part of it, you never did the short term memory part of it. You never thought, remember this question and rehearsed the question so that you can ask somebody later. And so sometimes, I'm sorry, I went crazy with the animation here. Um, again, working memory is not going to get information into long term memory. Only short term memory does that. In short term memory, you rehearse, and because you rehearse it, you get it encoded into long term memory. But in working memory, that does not happen. You can pull information out of long term memory, but you cannot encode memory into long term memory using your working memory. Again, there's the example I asked you. You might say, what did you get for question 10? And that person's going to say, I don't even remember what question 10 was. And sometimes they'll say, what was the actual question? And you'll go, I don't remember. I just remember question 10 because that's what I remembered. Um, again, working memory will not get information into long-term memory. This is why sometimes you're paying attention in class, and as a teacher is explaining something, you're like, yep, got it. Yep, I understand that. But when you get home, you don't remember. And you have to basically re-study everything to try to figure out how to do it. Because in class, you were using working memory to analyze what the teacher was saying, and it made sense. But you never rehearsed it. And if you don't rehearse it, then you don't get it into long-term memory. Okay? I just want to repeat this. In the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory, information comes in from the sensory world. You can see, hear, smell, taste, or touch it in sensory memory. But if you want it for longer, you have to focus on it. In short-term memory, you can do maintenance rehearsal to hold it in for a little bit longer. But if not, it's 30 seconds. Now, if you want it for longer than 30 seconds, then you have to rehearse it, which is going to include things like studying, thinking about uh, examples, breaking it down, etc. And that rehearsal will bring it into long-term memory. And then you can encode it into long-term memory. An easy way to think about it, or the way I think about it, is that my short term memory is like my receptionist. My receptionist or the receptionist in my brain gets information, goes over it, maybe types it up, and then files it over into long term memory. But my working memory is just working. They are just doing the analysis. And if they don't give the analysis over to the receptionist, then the receptionist never puts it into long term memory.